A king could not rule alone, no matter how powerful he was, no matter how absolute his authority seemed. One man could not control an entire kingdom. He needed people, men to advise him, men to manage his wealth, men to carry his orders, and sometimes shape them. Because behind every king, there was a group of individuals who made the kingdom function. Some worked in the open, holding official titles and responsibilities. Others operated quietly, closer to the king than anyone else, influencing decisions in ways no one could see. So, who were these men? Who stood beside the throne, not wearing the crown, but still holding power? Who controlled the king's words, his money, his secrets, and sometimes even his thoughts? And how did these men rise to such positions in a world where power was everything? Stay with us as we step inside the royal court of medieval Europe and meet the men who truly kept the kingdom running. Inside the royal court, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. From a distance, it looked organized, controlled, almost perfect. The king on his throne, nobles standing in order, servants moving quietly through the halls. But beneath that surface, something else was always moving. Ambition, fear, and quiet competition. Because every man in that court knew one thing: being close to the king could change your life, or end it. Let us begin with the men who stood closest to power, the advisors. These were the voices the king listened to when decisions had to be made. War, alliances, laws, nothing happened without their words reaching his ears first. But advice is never just advice. Each man had his own goals, his own loyalties, his own enemies. When an advisor spoke, he was not just guiding the king, he was shaping the future of the kingdom in a way that benefited him. And sometimes that meant hiding the truth. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the court was not a sword, but a suggestion. Then there was the chancellor, the man who controlled the king's words. Every law, every order, every letter that left the court passed through his hands. He decided how things were written, how they were delivered, and sometimes what was left unsaid. Think about that. If you control what the king says, you control how the kingdom understands him. A single change in wording could mean peace or war, and no one would ever know. Next came the treasurer. Gold was the lifeblood of the kingdom. Without it, there were no armies, no feasts, no alliances. The treasurer knew exactly how much the kingdom had, and more importantly, where it was going. He could strengthen one noble and weaken another. He could fund a war or quietly delay it. And if he chose to hide something, who would notice? Money, after all, moves silently. But not all power was written in titles. Some of it stood just a few steps from the king, watching everything. The chamberlain. He controlled access. Who could enter the king's private rooms? Who could speak to him alone? Who had to wait? And who would never be allowed in? And in a place where a single conversation could change everything. This made him one of the most powerful men in the court. Because sometimes power is not about speaking. It is about deciding who gets to be heard. Then there were the knights and guards. At first glance, they seemed simple. Men of strength, protectors of the king. But even they played a deeper role. They chose who to trust, who to watch, who might be a threat. And in moments of tension, their loyalty could decide the fate of everyone in the room. Because if a command was given, they would be the ones to carry it out, without hesitation. And then There were the men no one noticed, the servants. They poured wine, they opened doors, they stood silently in corners. But they heard everything, every whispered conversation, every secret agreement, every moment of weakness. They knew who feared who hated who was planning something dangerous. And in the wrong hands, that knowledge could be more powerful than any title. Some servants stayed silent. Others did not. Because in a court filled with ambition, information was currency, and secrets were weapons. Now imagine living in that world, every day surrounded by people who smile at you, but may be waiting for you to fall. Every word you speak could be repeated, every action judged, every mistake remembered. Trust was rare, and safety was an illusion. Men formed alliances to survive. They made promises they did not intend to keep. They supported each other until it was no longer useful. And when power shifted, and it always did, those who were once close to the king could suddenly find themselves alone, forgotten, or worse, removed. Because in the royal court, falling from favor was not just a loss of status. It could mean losing everything. Your position, your wealth, your freedom, sometimes your life. And yet, despite the danger, men kept coming, drawn by the same thing that made the court so dangerous in the first place. Opportunity, because for those who understood the game, who knew when to speak, when to stay silent, when to act, the court offered something rare: power. Not the kind that comes from wearing a crown, but the kind that controls it. So ask yourself, if you stood in that court, surrounded by whispers, secrets, and ambition, would you play the game? Would you risk everything to rise? Or would you stay in the shadows, hoping not to be noticed? Because in the royal courts of medieval Europe, the most powerful men were not always the ones you could see, and the most dangerous ones were the ones you never noticed at all.